June 1944. Normandy bocage due on Hedges' engines idling low. The Wehrmacht expected clumsy steel and shouted orders. Instead, they met silence that moved. 4 Shermans paused, antennae quivering, then pivoted as one smoke-bound flank before a Panther crew could finish a sentence. No miracle shell. No thicker armor. A quiet, invisible circuit FM drilled into a single grammar turned seconds into weapons. Across a lane, German optics found targets. American radios found timing. In the confusion that followed, long guns became slow guns, and ambush doctrine, so sure of itself, failed for a reason no range table had measured. They entered 1944 wrapped in the confidence of engineering Panthers with long 75s that bit clean through enemy fronts. Tigers that shrugged at distance. Optics so sharp they seemed to pull targets closer. Tactics were familiar and proven: catch the Allied advance where lanes narrowed, bleed it with fire from the hedgerow crowns, then counterpunch with armor that owned the first shot. Radio useful, yes, but hardly decisive, not in the mythology that steel and glass had built. In briefings and mess tents, they traded a comfortable arithmetic: better gun plus better sight equals first hit. First hit equals control. They had reasons. In Poland and France and the opening phases of Russia, tempo and wireless discipline had been German signatures. Even as attrition thinned specialists, the culture of initiative and gunnery persisted. Against the American Sherman high silhouette, modest armor confidence hardened into reflex. The plan was simple: fix the column with mines and panzerfausts, scythe the lead tank, break the net of movement, then reap the panic that always follows. They expected noise, literal and mental, because war is loud when orders wander. What they did not imagine was an enemy whose words traveled faster than fear, and whose average crews could behave like a single patient machine. They laughed because the math looked easy. The American tank, at least on paper and too often in photographs, was conspicuous and ordinary, a high silhouette that begged for a range card. Armor figures that made German gunners lick their pencils. A 75mm gun that looked like yesterday's answer to today's questions. The Sherman, they said, was a bus with a turret. The Americans, they said, were consumers of artillery, dependent, procedure-bound, and slow to decide without a major firing table blessing every step. An army like that, they believed, could be baited, fixed, bled, and broken. The Wehrmacht had a tight story to tell itself. In gunnery, they held the edge: long-barreled 7.5 K-42s that punched cleanly at distances. The American 75 struggled to touch Zeiss and Light's optics that braided glass and geometry into deadliness: loaders trained to make velocities rhythmic. Armor, too, fed the confidence: interlocked plates, good slopes, metallurgical discipline where it still survived, and enough battlefield encounters to prove that in a fair duel, German cats bit first and hardest. Doctrine honored deception and angles. The bocage, those hedgerows with ancient roots, looked like a gift, a ready-made labyrinth for the ambush artist. They studied American columns and saw habit they could punish. The U.S. liked roads because roads feed trucks and trucks feed war. Mines and culvert charges would shear the lead vehicle, stop the rest in a choke, and invite the Panzerfaust choir to sing. Infantry screens could be shaken by mortar surprise. The tanks, suddenly without a path, would mill reverse argue, because that is what tanks do when they must choose a bad option in a hurry. In this mental film, the Germans always controlled the first 30 seconds, and whoever controls the first 30 seconds writes the next 5 minutes in blood. Communications. They recognized its value after all they had pioneered: radios in early blitzkrieg. But attrition and improvisation had eroded neatness. Sets varied. Net discipline varied more. AM was serviceable, range-friendly, but the battlefield is a factory of noise, ignition, buzz, lightning, crackle, atmospherics, the sound of fear trying to sound like authority. They assumed the Americans, equally mortal, would drown in the same hiss. Even if the U.S. mounted sets widely, the Germans expected human noise to sabotage radio advantage: long sentences, uncertain orders, the mush of too many words sprayed into too many ears. They mocked the American habit of standardization as soulless. Same procedures, same checklists, same phrases. Surely that made men stiff, predictable, ripe for defeat by a clever mind in a good hull. They mistook repetition for dullness instead of speed. They mistook average crews for weak crews because they had spent years elevating the exceptional gunner, the ace commander, the magician, with a sight picture for every angle. When you build your hope around the virtuoso, the orchestra of competent men can sound unimpressive until it plays on cue every time. They counted on time as their ally. Even a superior enemy must translate seeing into saying, saying into doing. If you can rupture that translation, if you can steal 10 seconds with surprise or confusion, the better gun will find a target that hasn't yet found itself. The Germans believed they owned those 10 seconds. Mine's first shots training these were the keys. What they didn't count on was an opponent who had taken those 10 seconds into a workshop and shaved them down with files labeled brevity, net, discipline, SOP, and FM. And because pride needs witnesses, they kept their laughter public. In mess tents, they joked about American gasoline lighters, about high-riding silhouettes, about tankers who fought by telephone back to the guns. You can hear the punchlines in a dozen diaries, and remember them even if the ink smears. The Americans will come loud. We will answer quiet. They were right about one half. The Americans did come. But the loudness when it came traveled down a wire you couldn't see, and its first audience was not the enemy. It was 4 tanks who learned to hear the same sentence as the same movement every time. The Germans mocked what they could measure: armor thickness, muzzle energy, height in inches, traverse in degrees per second. They couldn't measure the thing that would make those measures feel slow. They were not blind. They were simply staring at steel while timing slipped past their shoulder like a polite guest on his way to work. The Americans had a problem that steel couldn't solve: command in a landscape designed to unmake it. The bocage wasn't just terrain. It was a radio test disguised as a hedge. Sunken lanes funneled sightlines into tunnels. Hedgerow crowns turned every field into a green room, with murderous acoustics and maps lied by omission. A platoon could be 30 yards apart and live in different worlds. In that world, seconds are more precious than armor, and the U.S. Army was bleeding seconds. Before Normandy, the Army's cure for uncertainty was massed fires, massed logistics, massed momentum. It works on plains and beaches. It falters when every 100 meters resets the conversation. In June and early July, coordination lagged. Tanks bumped a corner and backed into infantry who hadn't heard the plan. Infantry flagged a target that artillery received too late. A cautious halt to sort out the picture became an invitation for a Panzerfaust to edit the picture for you. The problem was not courage. It was latency in seeing, in deciding, and above all, in telling. Noise was everywhere. Atmospheric noise in AM sets, human noise in long, anxious orders, mechanical noise inside a tank where throat mics tangled with fear. Misheard commands and overlapping nets created ghost movements, units maneuvering toward ideas someone had only half spoken. The cure could not be more radio in the blunt sense. More sets without a shared grammar makes a choir of feedback. What the Army needed was not volume. It was clarity that survived contact and fatigue. Clarity begins with sameness. The Americans had already invested in sameness as a national religion: wrenches that fit everywhere, parts that swapped without a prayer, manuals that taught the same steps to men who had never met. But their spoken procedures, the way tank platoons actually moved on the day, still depended on personalities. In the hedgerows, personality is expensive. A brilliant lieutenant can die. A shaken sergeant can improvise badly. A system that relies on brilliance must spend lives buying brilliance. The untold problem was how to make competence beat genius at scale. The second layer of the problem wore a friendly face: combined arms. Artillery wanted precise, fast calls. Fighter bombers wanted talk that matched their speed. Infantry wanted tanks to act like big brothers who listened without drama. In theory, all those wants aligned. In practice, every service spoke a dialect. The field telephone on a reel could not keep up with a platoon bounding. A liaison jeep could not be at every corner. By the time an observer stitched the picture together, the picture had moved on. Then there was fear's arithmetic. Fear lengthens sentences. A tank commander who must explain too much will explain too long. A platoon leader who must invent phrasing on the fly will invent it differently under stress. Multiply that by 4 tanks, and you create latency, not in seconds, but in confidence. When men doubt what they heard, they hesitate. When they hesitate, geometry collapses, Overwatch loses its angle, smoke arrives after, need a flanking opportunity, ages out and dies. The army tried patches, more rehearsals, more hand signals, more reliance on prearranged fires, but patches fray under friction. The real need was a weapon that attacked latency itself. Something that turned seeing into saying, and saying into doing, without fat in the middle. Something that made 4 crews complete each other's sentences as if they had 1 throat and 8 hands. Call it Weapon Y if you like, but it was not a shell or a plate. It was an FM platoon net standardized hardware plus a ruthless grammar. The hardware would be boring on purpose. Reliable FM sets, think SCR 508 family, that favored intelligibility inside the short ranges of hedgerow war intercoms, that let the commander's mind flow to gunner and driver without static antennas maintained like rifles. The grammar would be stricter than any individual style brevity codes paired to muscle memory SOPs that made "on me hold smoke now" and shift right into actuators rather than advice. Together they would aim not at the enemy's armor, but at the enemy's 30 seconds. The untold problem was simple to write, and hard to live. American platoons were arriving at contact a little too messy, a little too late, and losing men to the price of explanation. To win the hedgerows, they needed a way to make average crews move like a practiced machine every time. Weapon Y FM radios married to discipline was the only honest answer. Not glamorous, not headline steel, just a system that taught talk to travel faster than fear and taught movement to begin before doubt remembered its lines. The laboratory was not a single room with secrets taped to the walls. It was an archipelago Fort Monmouth and its signal corps benches. Fort Knox and its armored school sand tables, training fields where dust settled into manuals before the ink had fully dried. Men in khaki shirts pulled tubes and crystals from brown crates and asked a battlefield question in an engineer's grammar. If seconds are the true ammunition of hedgerow war, how do we manufacture seconds on demand? They began by abandoning romance. AM had pedigree reach and myths attached to the early thunder of Blitzkrieg, but the bocage punished distance and rewarded clarity. FM, with its stubborn refusal to carry the hiss and crackle that make sentences stumble, became the quiet bet. The sets that emerged, the ones tankers would call by their catalog numbers with more affection than their official names, were designed to be boring on purpose, reliable, repairable, repeatable. They were not showpieces. They were habits in metal. Security in this project did not look like blueprints in safes. It looked like sameness. The enemy could steal a manual and still not steal the muscle memory baked into 1,000 repetitions. The Americans treated brevity like a classified chemical, distilled it into phrases that would mean one thing only, and then drilled until new sergeants dreamt those words in the right order. On me. Hold. Break left. Smoke now. Nothing poetic. Everything exact. If anyone asked where the encryption was, the instructors pointed to the clock. When a sentence takes 2 seconds instead of 7, you have encrypted those 5 seconds from the enemy's reach, at Benning map boards filled with grease pencil roots that only looked like lines. In truth, they were arguments settled before the argument began. At Knox, instructors staged quarrels with reality. A culvert collapsed here, a mine there, a wire fence that the platoon hadn't counted on. The cure was never genius. The cure was always the net. You don't teach men to improvise speeches in a panic. You teach them to recite short prayers together. That is not lack of initiative. It is initiative packaged for delivery under fire. The hardware shop, for its part, kept secrets by keeping promises. The FM tank set would start in the morning and still speak in the afternoon after heat and recoil did their best to shake syllables apart. Intercoms would give the commander a single throat through which to speak to his own machine. Power supplies would tolerate the tantrums of engines. Antenna mounts would not sulk in rain. The radio would not ask a crew to love it. It would ask only to be cleaned and checked like any other weapon. There were skeptics. Some officers wanted range, not just clarity. Some feared the tyranny of procedure, that living men would become extensions of a checklist, and therefore brittle. The test beds answered both. In field problems, the FM net did not prevent boldness. It localized boldness to the fewest, clearest words necessary to let 3 other crews enact it. A platoon leader who saw a chance did not need to explain the poetry of his vision. He needed only to say, "Bound white 2 on me, smoke ready," and the vision would arrive as a geometry of steel. Secrecy took a different shape in the weeks before Normandy. It was not enough to own the tool. The enemy must not understand how the tool was being used. Training cadres quietly standardized the invisible who speaks first after contact, what the default formation becomes after smoke, when not to talk at all because movement says it faster than vowels can. Instructors stole variety from the language and gave certainty back. You can read 10,000 words about mission command, or you can hear a lieutenant on an FM set say, "Shift right 3 hull lengths," and watch 4 50-ton sentences complete themselves without further commentary. Place mattered. The hedgerows themselves became a campus. On practice grounds in England with lanes and stone cottages standing in for the French maize platoons rehearsed the choreography until farmhands could tell time by the way the tanks moved. When they spoke on the net, there was no excitement in their voices. Secrecy of a different sort had been achieved. The enemy could hear nothing because there was nothing to hear. Calm is a kind of camouflage. By the time the ship sailed, the impossible idea no longer looked like a gamble. It looked like an industrial product, seconds machined to tight tolerances ready for field issue. A tank platoon was now a device with 4 moving parts and 1 thought. The thought traveled by FM. The thought did not arrive late. And every time a German crew waited for noise and met a sequence instead, the secret felt less like technology and more like fate. Begin with the physics, because the physics explains the feeling. Frequency modulation rejects amplitude jitters, the lightning engine whine and battlefield hash that swell and shrink the signal of AM, so the syllable that leaves a commander's mouth has a better chance of arriving with its edges intact. On a short, cluttered battlefield, hedgerows, villages, undulating lanes, that integrity matters more than heroic range. You are not calling Berlin. You are calling the 3 tanks that can save you in the next 15 seconds. Layer 2 is architecture. The platoon net is a small republic, 1 frequency, 4 voices, 1 set of rules. Above it sits the troop company control net. Beside it, the artillery or FAC tie-in when available. The trick is not novelty, but discipline. Who owns the first words after contact? Platoon leader. What the default call is for a quick bound. On me implies geometry already briefed when the wingman becomes the decision-maker on loss of lead, and which code word pulls smoke or a prearranged fire mission. Every set knows the ladder of escalation. Every crew can climb it in the dark. Layer 3 is intercom. A tank without an intercom is 4 men with 4 different clocks. The commander's eye is useless if his driver discovers the plan by rumor. The intercom makes the crew a nerve bundle. The FM net makes 4 bundles a hand. When the commander says, "Brake left," the driver turns, the gunner, slews the loader, knows what's coming next, and none of them has to steal attention from survival to ask what any of it means. Now add brevity. The glossary is not long because long glossaries fail under blast. Words are actuators. Hold on me, smoke now, shift right. 2, contact left, 2 o'clock, 400. The order of variables is fixed so that a brain at 160 beats per minute can still file them correctly. The net punishes adjectives because adjectives steal seconds and add nothing a turret can use. If a phrase can be shorter without losing meaning, it becomes shorter and stays shorter forever. Hardware details seem unromantic until they do not. Crystals set and checked to keep frequency drift from turning clarity into polite mutual ignorance. Antenna bases inspected so a day of rain does not turn a platoon into a pantomime. Power supplies buffered so that an engine's tantrum doesn't clip a sentence in half. A spare set lives in the support train with a tech who has seen this failure before. Mean time to repair is measured against the only unit that matters: 1 lull in contact. Security. No cloak and dagger is needed when your low transmission time and short working range reduce the opponent's chance to react. A net that speaks in brief bursts with predictable rolls and no chaff gives intercept operators less to chew than hunger can fix. Even if someone eavesdrops, what do they learn from white to hold? They learn you are competent. They do not learn enough to be alive when the competence arrives. Why can't the Wehrmacht detect and counter it quickly? Because you can steal a radio. You cannot steal the habits it requires. Habits are expensive to mint under fire. The Germans could field good sets and did, but their fragmentation of equipment, loss of trained signalers, and faith in individual virtuosity meant the average platoon could not guarantee the same sentence meant the same thing everywhere. The American secret sauce is not just FM, it is FM plus sameness. Sameness makes speed. Speed makes flanking angles appear out of nowhere. Angles make better guns feel strangely late. Finally, close the loop with combined arms. The same brevity that moves a platoon also cues artillery and air with minimal ceremony. A prearranged keyword pulls smoke in 20 seconds. A grid and a code word inform a ready battery. A FAC hears a simple vector and already knows the pattern he will fly. The enemy built to fear thunder hears only a short conversation and then thunder. This is the recipe. Physics that favors clarity architecture, that favors roles, intercoms, that fuse crews, brevity, that turns language into levers, maintenance that respects the mundane, and a culture that mass-produces the same good decision. Individually, none feels decisive. Together, they let 4 average tanks behave like a patient machine that thinks in seconds and speaks in solutions. Morning laid a pale cloth over the St. Lo ruins, the kind of light that makes dust look holy. Tanks idled in alleys where walls remembered other wars. The platoon net woke first. Check white 1, 2, 3, 4. No static, no poetry. Just the confirmations of a machine that breathed in 4 chests. Out beyond the church stump, hedges waited with their green knives out. Orders were not shouted to the world. They were fitted. White 1 on me bound. The lead Sherman nosed into the lane antenna, a metronome tick. 2 hold. A pause you could pour into a teaspoon. Smoke standby. Engines hushed to a working purr. And then the field performed its trick. The lane kinked left. The crown of the hedge lifted like a shoulder, and the geometry promised a good shot to anyone who owned surprise. Surprise belonged to the net. Contact left 2 o'clock, 400 gap. 7 words braided the world into something a gunner could use. The wingman slewed the loader's hands became a reflex, and the first burst of cokes stitched the hedge top where a glint had winked. Smoke now. White canisters arced, struck, and spilled a veil that did not hide confusion, because confusion had been denied entry. The lead tank pivoted through the thinning band, and the platoon refolded itself like a map, 1 up, 1 covering, 1 reloading sanity, 1 listening to the next room of the battlefield. Across the hedgerow, a German team waited for noise. None came. They triggered a Panzerfaust at a sound that belonged to yesterday and found their own lane filling with smoke and an angle they had not drawn. They fell back a hedge as doctrine suggested, and discovered doctrine was late. The ground south toward Marigny undulated like a shrug. Platoons stepped forward in short, repeatable conversations. Infantry moved inside those sentences, not behind them. Artillery perched like a thought you could summon with a word. Shift right 3 hull lengths. The phrase is nothing in a classroom. In a sunken road where a culvert might be a mine and a corner might be a farmyard ambush, it is the difference between being in a story and being in a report. By noon, the air had found its part. P-47s worked a pattern pre-briefed to the net, not to the weather. A forward captain voice, calm to the point of insult, fed a vector that had been agreed upon 2 nights before. Thunder blew mark smoke, west of lane 2, run 1 now. The Jabos answered with a sound that bent thought. The platoon did not watch. It used the sound to move. On me. Treads climbed the moment the noise lifted the net, already resetting rolls. An enemy built to fear thunder now feared the silence after it, the place where Americans did their best work. In the afternoon, a Panther probed the orchard edges, confident in the arithmetic of long guns and good glass. It found a lighthouse. Panther left tree line 800. That was all. The wingman turned. The 3rd tank searched the right flank for the hook that textbooks breed. The 4th called a ready battery with a code word that no one outside the net needed to understand. The Panther fired the first neat shot of a duel it did not own. Dirt lifted from a bank a foot left of White One's hull. The second shot never arrived, because the platoon had already moved the duel to a place where duels end quickly. The artillery timer, set by brevity, not by pleading, did the rest. What the Germans saw looked like cheating. They had planned punches to land when the American rhythm grew ragged. It did not. The rhythm was short and patient, and it repeated under stress the way a heart repeats. Mines drew smoke without speeches. Ambushes found flanks without bravado. Crossroads were crossed without drama because drama is expensive. Several times Wehrmacht squads tried to break the net with the ancient cure "kill the leader." A lucky fragment took a lieutenant. The conversation did not falter. Two has it. The new voice inhabited the same sentences. The machine breathed. Toward evening, the hedges gave way to longer fields, and fields are kind to radios that make movement honest. The platoon pushed through a low orchard, stopped at a line of poplars, and reset like a lung taking air before a sprint. White one on me. The daylight thinned. The net did not. The targets that day were few. The misunderstandings were fewer. Effect is not always visible. Sometimes it sounds like men not dying. When they parked behind a barn with shell-bitten eaves, the commander removed his throat mic and felt the pinch mark it had made. He looked up at the antenna, then at the map with pencil dust in its creases. He did not think about genius or fate. He thought about short phrases that had behaved themselves at speed. He thought about seconds that had arrived on time. The machine could rest. It had earned tomorrow. The first clear sign was not a burning tank. It was a sentence that arrived too late. A German NCO, good eyes and better instincts, flagged a hedge gap where Americans liked to ooze. He reported it through a radio that dragged each word through gravel. By the time the warning landed, the gap had already become a curtain of smoke, and the Americans had turned it into a door. The NCO felt a chill he could not name. He called it luck in front of his men. Alone, he called it something else. In company CPs strung along lanes with names no one could pronounce anymore, officers tried to sketch a pattern and found themselves writing music. The Americans did not hurry. They arrived. They did not charge. They appeared at flanks and corners exactly when a man's neck expected air. Reports spoke of 4 tanks moving with one patience of infantry that never seemed lost for longer than a breath of artillery that fitted itself into moments as if the moment had been measured before dawn. A captain asked whether the enemy had found a new map. The adjutant, who had seen patterns before, said no. A new clock. Panic does not begin with shouting. It begins with a question that cannot hold still. How did they know a mine pops under a culvert? The Americans throw smoke without consulting fear. A flanking tank appears exactly where a Panther thought the lane bent to safety. How did they know a machine gun team digs into a hedge crown? A minute later, the crown coughs white, and a Sherman's turret slews to meet them with the bored accuracy of someone who has practiced this meeting in a mirror. How did they know each time the question returns, it has fewer places to hide? Attempts to answer it turned cruel. They must have a forward observer on our side of the line. Patrols were sent. They found only the usual tracks, cigarette ends, the rumor of footsteps. Their leaders are unusually capable. Shoot one, then. The next voice that came on the American net sounded the same, and the movement that followed it looked identical, neither braver nor slower, just correct. Their tanks coordinate with aircraft by some sorcery. The sorcery once glimpsed was worse than magic. It was work brief, bland words that unlocked heavy things. At Marigny, the realization stopped pretending to be subtle. A Panther platoon slid into an orchard and prepared an ambush that textbooks would autograph. The first shot was clean. The second was interrupted by a geometry that was not in the book smoke, at an angle that bled the sight picture, a lateral bound by a wingman who did not ask permission, and a correction that arrived in time to be used. Artillery stitched the field in short sentences. When the smoke lifted, the orchard had fewer certainties. In the reports that survived, some Germans were honest. They called the American coordination unangenehm schnell, unpleasantly fast. They said the enemy's radios were surprisingly clear under fire. They said the infantry and tanks behaved as if they shared a single will. Others spared their pride by invoking numbers as if quantity alone could teach 4 men to move like one thought. But even the proud adjusted their tone in private. They began to plan not for American mistakes, but for American sequences. That was the worst part. Once you believe the enemy owns the sequence, every hedge feels treacherous because you are playing a beat behind the metronome. Mines become speed bumps, not denial. First shots become invitations, not conclusions. Counterattacks begin already late. The command net, hearing the shape of defeat, before the numbers confirm it, starts to wobble requests for clarification that multiply. Duplicate orders that cancel confidence. A looseness in time that smells like retreat hours before anyone says the word. Toward evening, a company fell back 2 fields to a line a major insisted would reset the fight. It did not reset the clock. American tanks appeared not faster, but in time, which is worse. A flanking pair took the angle the major had drawn for his own panzers. An observer called for smoke and received it while his sentence was still warm. The major watched, mouth set hard, and understood he was not facing magic. He was facing habits that had survived the day intact. When darkness came, it brought no comfort. The Americans did not grow clumsy. They grew quiet. Their radios did not add drama to the night. They shortened it. The major wrote one sentence in his notebook before sleep. A sentence that requires no translation. We are fighting a machine. Strategy is a ladder built from rungs of moments. If your moments are late, your strategy is old the second it touches ground. The Sherman FM platoon radio net SCR 508-538 plus intercom and standardized brevity/SOP did not just make platoons quicker, it made operational design honest. The American way of war had always promised scale. Now it promised timing. And timing is how you turn numbers into inevitability rather than traffic. In Normandy, the effect was local. At first, hedgerows that centuries had designed to block conversation suddenly felt porous. A platoon could move like a sentence with punctuation, and companies could stack those sentences into paragraphs that battalions understood at a glance. When Operation Cobra broke open, it wasn't only because bombs plowed lanes. It was because the units waiting at those lanes could fill them without asking the same questions twice. Radios held the line between chaos and exploitation. Once the gap appeared, the net made it wider by denying hesitation its favorite meal. As the pursuit began, Marigny to Coutances-Avranches to the open country, the net converted speed into shape. German staff officers still tried to compose counterattacks with Panthers positioned for the textbook flank. They found that the textbook expected an enemy with pauses big enough to live in. The American pauses had been shortened to the size of a breath. Counterstrokes landed on places that had already moved. When panzer battle groups tried to jerk the wheel back toward control, they discovered that control belongs to the side that already decided. In the Hürtgen, where trees ate maps and sound, the radios did not make the forest kind. They made it survivable. Units bled less to the price of explanation. When a culvert went wrong or a mine lifted a track, the sentence "2" has it kept geometry intact. Every time the net prevented a small panic, it preserved a small plan. Every preserved plan lengthened the life of the larger plan riding atop it. By winter, the accumulation of seconds, millions of them, had become a strategic asset, as real as gasoline. The culture spread sideways. Infantry learned to trust the brevity that armor used. Artillery trimmed its dialogue to meet the same clock. Air-ground teams wrote playbooks that required fewer adjectives and more pre-briefed meanings. What began as the quiet competence of a tank platoon matured into a combined arms dialect. In that dialect, initiative traveled faster than rank. A sergeant with a clean sentence could move steel that a major used to shepherd. German doctrine did not stand still, but it struggled in 2 cages, attrition and fragmentation. Equipment mixes and training gaps produced nets that sounded different from unit to unit. And post-43 losses drained the schools that mint habits. You can copy hardware quickly. You cannot copy trust on demand. The Wehrmacht tried to buy seconds with courage and often did, but courage spends itself. The American system paid in process, reproducible, exportable to replacements, indifferent to personality. It is the most unromantic way to win a war and the most reliable. At the operational level, the radios pulled a quiet theft. They stole the Axis decision cycle. Contact reports converted to flanks in under a minute. Flanks converted to artillery bites in under 5. Bites converted to boundary shifts before sundown. The map on the American side looked untidy arrows that bent and corrected as if written by a restless hand, but it was the untidiness of fast learning. Across the line, neat plans had to survive long enough to matter. They often didn't. By 1945, the lesson was no longer local or seasonal. In the Ruhr pocket in cities whose names had been iron once and were now chalk, the net produced the same dividend, the right small unit arriving in time, not just in strength. Leadership could plan boldly because the system could execute modestly without drama. Strategy freed from fear that the bottom might wobble grew aggressive. And when strategy grows aggressive on top of a base that talks in seconds, the result is not merely movement. It is momentum, the kind you can't counter with a better gun, because the shot you need is always a beat behind. The radios did not make American tanks invulnerable. They made the Axis theory of control obsolete. A doctrine that depends on seizing the first half-minute will fail against an army that manufactures half-minutes the way it manufactures shells. The war machine rolled because its smallest parts, 4 men, 1 net, kept arriving on time. After the guns, there are sentences. In interrogation rooms and post-war papers, the pride thinned and the admissions surfaced. German officers asked to explain why American armor felt stronger than it looked, reached for numbers, and then quietly for coordination. One Panzer commander said that U.S. tank infantry action was unpleasantly quick, the radios clearer than expected under fire, and the artillery too ready to be coincidence. Another pressed on why ambushes failed after a clean first shot, answered that the second minute belonged to them. He had planned for courage. He had not planned for a culture where the same words always meant the same thing. From higher desks came cooler phrases. Industrial ministry reports filed in the late stages of defeat conceded an organizational advantage that equipment could not cancel. The Americans, it noted, had standardized not only parts but behaviors, and that this sameness produced speed. Speed produced angles. Angles defeated steel. In staff commentary that would guide a different German army after the war, analysts warned that future forces must invest as much in net discipline and common brevity as in armor thickness, because clarity is a weapon that ages slowly. A Luftwaffe veteran attached to ground units near St. Lo wrote that he had expected thunder to announce itself, and instead found short conversations that turned into action. He did not mean magic. He meant work habits minted in training halls and paid forward under stress. The line reads drier in translation, but the meaning survives. They were not better everywhere. They were the same everywhere. That was enough. So this is the last admission, and the only one that matters. The Allied edge did not rest in a single miracle machine. It rested in Sherman FM radios, SCR 508-538, lashed to a language that refused to waste time. When seconds are the real currency, the army that spends them well wins, even when the enemy believes his steel can buy them back.